Wait a minute, wasn't this an Ornithopter channel? If I'm being honest, I'm sick to death of dealing with rotor torques, so let's check in on those. If you've been following this little Create Aeronautics detour of mine, you probably remember Jeremy here. He's got all the grace, agility, and even the proportions of the crane flies lurking in your garage, but he means well. And he is, against all odds for the first attempt at one, a barely airworthy ornithopter. I say against all odds because, emboldened by Jeremy, I tried a few more of him in a week or two afterwards, and suffice to say it was all downhill from him. My fortunes have turned since then, but before we get into all that, I think old Jeremy deserves better than a 20-second clip thrown together at 3 a.m. on a work night. So, how does Jeremy work? Lucky for us, he's not too complicated. If you're more familiar with Create Aeronautics than I was, then you probably already know. At his heart, all Jeremy is a clock that flips its signal from one side to the other at a regular interval. This clock runs as long as you hold the spacebar, and as it does, it triggers opposing sides of the directional gearboxes mounted left and right. These directional gearboxes accept a constant rotation from a motor, and the output is fed in turn through a torsion spring, converting the clockwise and counterclockwise movement into an angle between positive 45 and negative 45, which can then be used to flap the wing. I arrived at the shaft speed I used to drive this whole mechanism through simple guess and check. For as much thrust as possible, naturally you want the wings to beat as fast as possible, but it turns out it's not quite as simple as running a high input shaft speed. For one, I learned much later that swivel bearings are capped at 96 RPM. More critically for Jeremy, though, their traversal is physically simulated and doesn't happen instantly. That traversal rate only goes down as load on the bearing goes up, and Jeremy's wings here make for quite a bit of load. If I were to feed 256 or even 96 RPM into poor Jeremy, his wings would make it through only a fraction of their total flap range, reducing their overall thrust, and I think introducing a risk that the center point of the flap might wander up or down, since the flap angle is no longer making it all the way to either torsion spring detent. So ultimately, peak performance is a curve, first increasing with shaft speed and then beginning to fall off and then sink again as the wings are no longer able to get all the way to their maximum flap range. So I spent a while air tossing Jeremy with various shaft speeds, and the number I arrived at was 42, all aboard the Starship Math. Now, 42 may not be Jeremy's peak thrust speed, but as you can see, he's a bit of an ungainly fellow. The harder Jeremy flaps, the worse this gets, but 42 proved to be a good compromise between enough thrust to fly and a faster, higher flying vehicle with the flight characteristics of a Half-Life 2 Seagull ragdoll. But how does Jeremy tilt the incidence of his wings up and down as he beats them? Doesn't an ornithopter need to angle its wings as it goes to generate angle of attack and therefore thrust? Well, actually, in Create, they don't need to, but that's for later in the video. For now, let's assume we do require some angle of attack like an ordinary God-fearing simulator. After all, Jeremy clearly changes the angle of his wings while he flaps. Oh, and in case you're just joining us from the Minecraft fandom, angle of attack describes the angle between a wing and its oncoming wind. Wings generate lift and drag as a function of angle of attack. As for Jeremy, again, if you're a Create Aeronautics veteran or a veteran of one of several physics games, you probably already know what's happening. Swivel bearings, being physically simulated, are not perfectly rigid. This means a few things for us, most of them bad. We'll get to that later on in the video. One thing it does mean, though, is that we can use them almost as if they were an elastic. Jeremy's wings are designed so that the sum of all the forces acting on them will be offset backward from the bearing they're mounted to. This provides a lever for the force of the beating wing to act on the bearing, so while it's pushing Jeremy up, it also wrenches the wing around in its socket to generate angle of attack, much the way a weather vane tilts into the wind. Is this the best way of doing things? No idea. It does work, though. And to be clear, these bearings are locked, it's just the sheer force of the wing that's overcoming the bearing position. I've seen a few other designs on the internet that work by allowing the wing to flap up and down between physical notches, and I suspect that these will work better on smaller wings, but the only attempts I've made at them so far have failed. I will say Jeremy shakes a lot, and I've built some smaller ornithopters since then that do drive their blade angles with shafts, and they seem to shake a whole lot less. We'll get to them. But for now, this strategy is definitely viable, and I'll definitely be revisiting it in the future. It's simple, doesn't take up too much space, and it adjusts dynamically to the amount of force on the wing, and therefore how fast the wing is beating. So that's Jeremy. His record of being, functional would stand among my ornithopters for quite some time. So, what are the ones that followed him that didn't quite make it? A few were false starts that never really went anywhere at all, and this is about the time I finally got a Create Aeronautics server together with the lads and actually started playing the video game. That stoked some interest in more practical builds that could operate in survival without massive airstrips, which translates roughly to airships and helicopters. For instance, check out this PID controlled altitude hold I developed to get around the burner signal strength limiting airships to a maximum of 15 discrete altitudes. And how about this double digit base 16 accumulator I developed to get around burner strength limiting airships to maximum 15 discrete altitudes? Neither of which got deployed on any actual vehicle. I did get really nerd sniped with PID controllers for a little while. The Create Aeronautics Redstone components make it seem like they're going to be really easy to do, but it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure it out. I'm glad I did, though. In the very least, this burner auto leveler I spent like 5 days on made it into service, so good enough for me. But I needed a break here and there, and in that time I built another ornithop. Behold, Timothy. Timothy is based on the work of Mizda, who published a similar design to YouTube at this link. Now, just as with Flyout, Gary's mod has really conditioned my ideas of what should and should not be possible in Create Aeronautics. By and large, I find that the Gmod mindset makes much better predictions about the behavior of Create Aeronautics than it does about Flyout. But even then, controlling wing incidents by physically restraining the wings between pegs is not something that Gary's mod could even dream of getting away with, not to mention a physical crank like this. And to be honest, I hadn't really thought I could get away with it here. Jeremy didn't foster a whole lot of confidence in Create Aeronautics constraints. I had enough trouble with Joint Slop getting him flying. So something like this seemed out of the question. But here was Mizda flying. And not just any flying either, but gentle, graceful flying, far removed from Jeremy's spastic seagull act. I was really impressed with Mizda's results, and excited to have the option to build a crank ornithopter at all. For reference, a lot of the toy ornithopters you'll see people build IRL on YouTube use a mechanism a lot like this powered by rubber bands, so it's interesting to have the possibility of building it here. So I sat down to try to replicate Mizda's results. Originally, I wanted to adapt the design into a seesaw mechanism like my high frequency flyout and Stormworks ornithopters, but in the end, I couldn't come up with a good crank mechanism for the seesaw wing, and settled for recreating Mizda's design more or less exactly. This is what I ended up with. I'm not totally sure what Mizda is doing differently than me that they got away with a much smaller aircraft than I was able to, but the results are ultimately similar. Critically for how I would develop ornithopters going forward, though, they didn't seem similar at the time. While Mizda's design was beautifully stable, no matter what I did, I could not keep Timothy from developing a ton of asymmetric thrust, not unlike earlier versions of Jeremy. This was that swivel bearing slop back to bite me, and at the time I couldn't make sense of why Mizda's ornithopter didn't suffer from it, but Timothy did. I couldn't seem to fix Timothy, so I shelved him. Sorry, Timothy. But that wasn't the end of him. Like a month later, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, I found a sort of solution that fixes the joint slop like 60% of the time. And as I was coming back to record this here video, I tried fixing Timothy using just that method. And bam, Timothy flew straight as an arrow after that. And fly he did. If you watch closely, Timothy is consistently losing a bit of energy over the course of his flight. I don't think he's quite capable of positive rate. But for a single wing ornithopter, man, that's smooth. You can walk around on him if you want. So it turns out I was a lot closer to success here than I thought I was at the time, and this sort of Timothy design is definitely something I'm going to look at again in the future. As sexy as insectoid designs can be, I've always had a soft spot for bird-style ornithopters. And the prospect of one that's able to flap so gently that you can walk around on it is enchanting. Unfortunately, Timothy's sudden airworthiness is a very recent discovery of mine, so we'll have to come back to this in another video in the future. But there's a silver lining, and that silver lining is I went back to the old mechanical design and made a lot of improvements. So let's jump forward a couple months to a Deco Fox who's built a couple of airships, a couple of helicopters, and knows a hell of a lot more about Create Aeronautics. Here's a new design. Much improved from the original I built in my first couple hours of Create Aeronautics while distracted by Beastars. And the last season of that show is way better than the rest of it. Anyway, I've learned a lot about Create since then, and with that knowledge, I've been able to miniaturize the hell out of the mechanism. eliminate the massive secondary lifting surfaces that the original design used to rely on, and use the main wing for both lift and propulsion. I also tamed the shake a bit and improved the overall performance to the point that it seems to cruise at about 120 meters now. This is all still very experimental. We're still relying on an air spawn here, and I am not sure how I'm going to deal with the issue of wing clearance against the ground, but we are at last beginning to flirt with practicality. I give you Bartholomew. But why is Bart so much smoother than Jeremy? Well, there's a few design differences, but the big revelation is that Bart is the first build where I recognized the joint issues and resulting asymmetric thrust problems I kept encountering were not a limitation of Create Aeronautics, but an actual bug, something that could be mitigated and, fingers crossed, in the future could be fixed altogether. Free from the obligation of having to design an ornithopter that could somehow survive having the asymmetric thrust bug, as Jeremy technically could, I was able to build Bart smaller, beat his wings faster, and be more exacting about where I located them and his overall center of mass. So, what am I doing about the joint problem? Well, nothing so complete as either of us might hope, but it's a start. Oh, yeah, let's get into joint slop. Take a look at this example. See how one side is floppier than the other? This is the same thing that was happening to the original Ornithopter design. But while I was developing this design, I got lucky. I built and flew the whole thing before this problem developed. And it flew beautifully. So, what I was dealing with wasn't just a limitation of Sable that I was going to have to learn to live with. There had to be some kind of solution to it, or at least some kind of specific cause. So, if it flew before, what happened? It's hard to say exactly. My original theory was some kind of joint hierarchy issue. The physics solvers in most video games process physically simulated joints sequentially. So, if the order in which the joints are processed changes, so too does the behavior of the joints overall. It also usually means that joint accuracy and stiffness decays along a chain of joints. This is true in a lot of physics engines, even flyouts, though the consequences are not nearly as harsh there as in most others. Usually, the cure is simply to avoid chaining joints as much as possible. And in some cases, Stormworks being the chief offender, as I understand from some Stormworks builders who are more talented than me, order matters a lot. So I thought maybe the reason it worked before and not now is because between now and then I had locked and unlocked the bearings. So maybe if I unlocked the bearings in a different order than I originally placed them, I would also change the order in which the bearings were simulated, and the slop would come from there. That seemed rational, and fortunately, it was also very easy to test. I had only to try locking and unlocking the bearings in various orders. So I tried that, and that wasn't the problem. No matter what order I locked or unlocked the bearings, I always arrived at the same result: a pair of wings that was floppier on the right side than the left. But in the process of running that test, I noticed something. When I had a floppy joint, it would appear to go away as long as the fuselage was frozen or held with the fizz gun. If released, bam, slop. So could it maybe be a problem with freezing? It turns out yes. If you freeze a contraption, lock its bearings, and then unlock them while the contraption is still frozen, it can, although strangely does not always, result in the joints being weak, floppy, and asymmetric. Fortunately, this is easy to fix. All you need to do is freeze the contraption again, lock the bearings, unfreeze the contraption, and then unlock the bearings while the contraption is unfrozen. I tried that, and the issue went away from me immediately. I'm pretty sure this is repeatable, so let's try it right now. Let's see if I can break this ornithopter and then fix it. Guess what? It wasn't repeatable. I'm in the right area, but there's definitely more going on than what I just said. Sometimes you need to freeze the contraption and lock and unlock all the joints while it's frozen. Sometimes you need to unfreeze the contraption and lock and unlock all the joints while it's unfrozen. Sometimes you need to freeze the contraption, lock the joints, unfreeze the contraption, and then unlock them. Each time, it seems like only one of these things will work. But if you try everything with everything, eventually one of them will work, or at least so far one of them always has worked for me. I originally intended to show the process for figuring this all out in real time in this video, but I have almost fallen asleep twice editing it, so I don't think it's all that entertaining or, frankly, all that helpful. I am going to keep the last clip, though, some candid footage of me troubleshooting a freshly broken ornithopter to serve as a lifeline for anyone else who might be trying to fix the same problem. I solved this one by freezing the ornithopter, locking the joints, unlocking the joints, and unfreezing. I swear the other workflows are sometimes necessary. When this one broke the first time, I had to have it unfrozen to fix it, but who knows? Maybe it's confirmation bias and there's no real pattern to it at all. The important point right now is they can be fixed, and it has something to do with freezing bodies and locking parts. Alright, I've recreated the issue. Why now? Couldn't tell you. But there's our asymmetry. And if I let it go, it remains asymmetrical. Okay, so let's try the theorized fix. It is annoying that the reproduction seems to be random, as even if this does fix it, we'll never really... There'll always be maintenance that has to be done periodically. I'm hoping that there's something more consistent than that that can be done. Alright, it's all unfrozen. I'm not sure if the order of unfreeze matters. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Still looks bad frozen. Does it shape up unfrozen? No. Well, it's better, but it's not fixed. That got it. Okay, so that time it had to be frozen. The mystery deepens. So there you have it. For just 15 odd random desperate joint clicks a day, you too can save a wounded ornithopter. I really hope something can be done about this bug in the long term because it sucks. Alright, enough speculating about whatever sigils and incantations might best tame create aeronautics. Let's do something fun. As luck would have it, I've learned about a lot more than just joints and the relative stability or slop of them, so let's have a look at some of that. First, the infamous seesaw wing, brainchild of famed YouTube commenter Ant Soldier, who mentioned the idea in the comments of a Stormworks video of mine 5 ever ago. The gist of it is quite simple. Rather than flap the wings, what if we rocked them? But why rock them? Why not just have 2 pairs of opposing wings? Something a bit closer to an actual dragonfly. Ornithopters with 2 pairs of opposing, conventionally flapping wings have 2 problems. While they can have the torque and the swivels of their front and back wing set cancel each other out, each wing set individually still goes up at the same time and down at the same time. This means the reaction force from accelerating each wing up and down is not cancelled. The forward wing is always accelerating opposite the rear wing, but they're at different stations longitudinally, so the resulting reaction forces force the ornithopter up and down in a pitch oscillation. And 2, the wing sets themselves are angled in a way that creates a pitch input, with the forward wing set acting like a giant canard and the aft wing set acting like a giant elevator. This doubles down on the oscillation problem. Rocking wing ornithopters solve both these problems together by distributing both the lift forces of the wings and the reaction forces from accelerating them diagonally rather than longitudinally. A well-built rocking wing ornithopter is almost completely force neutral at all times, and can be almost as smooth as a conventionally propelled aircraft. Now, I do know that this opposing wing system that I described is not exactly what dragonflies do. Instead, their forward and rear wing set operate only about half out of phase with each other. But I've had pretty bad results trying to get that to work in flyout, and I have yet to really try it here, mostly because I'm not really sure how to handle the gearing to make sure it stays consistently offset by that much. So, for now, we'll be working with wings driven 180 degrees out of phase, regardless of whether they've been constructed in a conventional or in a rocking configuration. That brings us to Rebecca. Thanks to the rocking wing design, Rebecca is simpler, lighter, faster, and smoother flying than any of her siblings. Rather than having to mount a flapping motor on both sides of the aircraft and then feed incidence control through both of those motors, we instead only need one flapping motor per wing set mounted centerline. That singular mounting point can then be used to flap both sides of the blade, and through the use of a gearbox, adjust the incidence of both simultaneously. So far, this approach has proven superior for multiblade ornithopters in every single game engine I've tried to build one in, and it's not looking like Minecraft is about to be the first exception. As you can see, Rebecca means business. Just look at that climb performance. Rebecca does have one major weakness, though, and looking at her, you can probably tell what it is. Because both blades are mounted to the same shaft, they cannot be given dehedral. For those of you joining us from the Minecraft community who might not be familiar with that term, dihedral describes how much a wing is angled up or down along its span, with the term dihedral applying to positive numbers and anhedral applying to negative numbers. For an example, your average paper airplane has a lot of dihedral. Meanwhile, aircraft like the Harrier and the F-104 have a lot of anhedral. The reasons for this can get complicated pretty quick, and in real life, there are many aerodynamic consequences of doing this, some of them desirable, some of them not. But for us in Minecraft, what we're mostly interested in is just clearing the ground with our big flapping wings. And if we can't angle our wing up relative to the ground, that becomes challenging. As a result, seesaw ornithopters are restricted to much lower amplitudes than non-seesaw ornithopters, where we can just bias a ton of dehedral into the wing so we can ensure we still clear the ground even if we sweep a very large angle over the course of a single flap. So if a seesaw ornithopter can't flap as far as a regular ornithopter, it's going to need to flap faster if it wants to achieve the same amount of thrust. The aircraft you see here is my first really solid attempt at achieving that in a package both small enough to be practical and functional enough to be airworthy. There's probably a lot of performance headroom here still, but I'm pretty happy with what I'm seeing so far. Here she is running on two Blaze Cake fueled portable engines. Not half bad for the speed and altitude she's capable of, if you ask me. It seems like if you play your cards right, you can beat the efficiency of propellers doing this. But I haven't exactly done any empirical testing, and two portable engines on a frame as light as Rebecca's would certainly get a lot of work done. But I'll leave arguing the relative merits of ornithopters and conventional aircraft as an exercise for the viewer. I'm mostly just interested in them for their own sake. One thing you'll notice about Rebecca, particularly in this third person footage, is that she cruises with a substantial nose down attitude at low altitude. This is because I'm using regular sails and not symmetric sails to form her propulsive wings, something I started doing with Bartholomew. Originally, I did this for two reasons. The first, vaguer reason is that bird wings are usually not symmetric airfoils, and I thought the sort of behavior I was looking for would be better modeled with something generating lift rather than only drag. The second reason is I like my Ornithopter's primary lifting surface to also be the primary propulsive surface. I'd rather not rely on a sail wing as big or even larger than my propulsive wing if I can avoid it, even if it did work out for Aldebert Schmidt. Call it a taste thing. I certainly wouldn't disqualify something from the noble ranks of ornithopters simply because it has a static main wing, but when you picture an ornithopter that's probably not what you're thinking about, you get me. If I wanted to accomplish that with an ornithopter using only symmetric sails, it would be stuck at a very high cruise angle of attack. That would mean an awful lot of drag. It'd look weird, and for as understated as lift tends to be in Create Aeronautics already, I didn't want to deal with it. But while I was working on Bartholomew, I noticed something interesting that I didn't quite expect. It seems when the Ponderous says sails create lift and not drag, they mean that very literally, as in sails do not seem to generate any force at all when being pushed straight upward along their normal axis. Now, for Rebecca, that's a bit of a raw deal. If that's true, then her sails aren't doing any work on the upstroke. That's pretty much all wasted energy, leaving her much slower than she otherwise could be. In the future, it might be best for designs like Rebecca's to use a mix of symmetric and asymmetric sails in each wing, perhaps using asymmetrics along the leading edge and symmetrics along the trailing edge. But in any case, all that wackiness gave me an idea. If sails literally don't generate force against the upward component of their movement, then we don't need to change the angle of our wings in real time at all. Meet Cassandra, a VTOL ornithopter powered entirely by torque generated from Daniel Bernoulli rolling over in his grave. I have kind of mixed feelings about this. I'd still call it an ornithopter, but what's going on here has zero bearing on reality. Does that defeat the purpose? I do think that the capital O ornithopterness of this sort of thing is a little bit less compelling than what Bart and Rebecca have going on, but at the end of the day, this isn't Flyout. This is Minecraft, and what Cassandra has going on is pretty interesting in its own right. For one, it means we don't have to worry about the wing angle shafts falling out of phase with the wing beat, which is something that can happen to Rebecca, necessitating the whole freeze, unfreeze, and hope for the best routine. So, in that sense, in my mind, it's a blessing provided by the physics engine to make up for a shortcoming in that same engine. For another point, we don't need incidence control to achieve lift and thrust, but we do still have it, and that means we can get real creative with what we do with that shaft. Spice, anyone? Paul's mechanism is much like Cassandra's, but he's gained a cockpit and active blade control. With these tools, he's able to take off vertically, maneuver in a hover, and transition in and out of forward flight. You'll notice Paul lacks the external control surfaces other designs have used. Instead, Paul's pitch, yaw, and roll control are built directly into the blades. He's nowhere near as fast as Rebecca, but the maneuverability, flexibility, and raw cool factor are hard to argue with, especially when Minecraft so seldom graces us with flat spots big enough to build giant runways. Unfortunately, Paul has a long way to go. I'm trying to do this all with vanilla Create Aeronautics, so mixing this kind of control is a challenge. I do think there's a lot of room to improve. I threw Paul together in about 40 minutes to prove the concept, but as he is, he has a few big limitations. You know how I said that both roll and yaw control were mixed into the blades? Yeah, they're mixed into the same axis. And yaw is backwards, and also roll control doesn't exist in vertical flight, and there's a ton of adverse yaw on roll control in forward flight. Paul is really only flyable in the strictest sense. But with this approach, we might be able to tackle some of the features otherwise only seen in Frank Herbert's funny worm ornithopters, all without breaking from vanilla Create Aeronautics. Pretty interesting, and a rabbit hole for later. That brings us to our last design of the day, Martin. The Paul strategy is, like I was saying, a rabbit hole that I could disappear into for weeks. So, before jumping in, I wanted to experiment with that other quality of ornithopters that abuse this monodirectional behavior of sails. The potential to build a conventionally controlled, conventional takeoff ornithopter that is smaller, lighter, and immune to the transient shaft misalignment issue. Something small, practical, and ideal for survival world. Martin is nothing more than a wing rocking mechanism and two pairs of manually angled wings, configurable when landed by handle. With this static blade angle, Martin is able to generate both lift and thrust by simply rocking his wings, achieving impressive VTOL performance and reasonable cruise performance for the low price of one blaze-fueled portable engine. He's not quite as powerful or as smooth as Rebecca, but I think he makes for a healthy middle ground around which one might build a proper survival vehicle with an actual interior and stuff. It's tough to fit a cabin around a lot of the other designs, but Martin maybe. In the short term, I think I'm going to see about optimizing designs like Martin's and perhaps Paul's. I think there's a lot of potential for improvement there, and since I have a survival world going, I'd like to come up with some nice survival friendly designs to share with my friends and the rest of the world. I'd really like to invest more time into designs like Rebecca and Bartholomew that actually oscillate their blade angle, but I think I'm going to give the Create Aeronautics devs a chance to perhaps fix the joint slot problem before I sink too many weeks of my life into fighting with it. Regardless, having seen how close Timothy was to flying, I have got to experiment with some large scale crank and Rebecca like ornithopters with walkable interiors. I doubt that'll ever be practical, but God, it would be cool. And in the longer term, don't worry, this isn't going to turn into a Minecraft channel. Flyout remains my darling, and I've got a big auto gyro project in the works. I've been kind of dragging my feet on that one because, unlike thrustwings and ornithopters, I'm not really bringing any new information to the table. So, if you're going to choose me as a source over, say, Wikipedia, I had better have good information and solid explanations. But a few people were asking me about them, and I have a flyout project I'm very proud of to go with it, so that's coming sooner rather than later, by my standards anyway. I've even been working on a few new flyout ornithopters since my building has improved. Hopefully, I can show those all to you soon. In the meantime, man, I've got 2,000 hours in flyout. Foxes can have a little Minecraft as a treat. Have a pleasant voyage, by the light of your stars and the flame of your lantern.